The night split open with a scream of tires as Jack Mercer swerved on County Road 9, and the thing crossed the beams like a shadow given bones. Jack said, "Did you see that, Ben?" Ben Carter gripped the dash and said, "It wasn't a deer." The radio cracked into static, and a 911 voice melted into a gasp that sounded far away. The woods pressed close like a crowd that refused to speak. Something thumped the bed of the truck, and the tailgate rattled. Jack said, "We're not stopping." The fog peeled off the asphalt like wet skin. A shape leapt the ditch and vanished, tall, jointed wrong, eyes like coal in a furnace. Ben said, "Tracks tomorrow, we check." The cab stank of cold metal and fear. A farmhouse light flicked once, and died. A howl rode the tree line, not coyote, not human. Jack said, "It knows we saw it," and the road kept running but felt shorter than breath. Morning crawled in gray and slow. Jack parked by the cattle fence where the road curved like a hook. Ben swung the gate and said, "Tracks," then answers. A heifer lay on its side, eyes glassy, hide split clean. Jack said, "No blood trail." Flies gathered but stopped short, as if pushed back by something unseen. Sheriff Dana Holt paced the fence and said, "Coyotes tear. This looks staged." Ben said, "Coyotes don't cauterize." Jack pressed a palm beside a print too long, too human. A crow called once, then fell silent. Dana said, "Bag your theories, Mercer," but her voice cracked where fear hid. At the diner, steam rose from coffee like secrets no one claimed. Jack slid a napkin to Dana with a sketch of the print. Jack said, "It circled our truck." Dana stirred coffee and said, "Stories circle faster?" Ben said, "We saw it leap a ditch no man could." Conversations paused, then resumed. Dana said, "Fear breeds shape in fog." Jack said, "Livestock is not fog." The counterman wiped already clean chrome. Dana said, "I'll call a vet." Ben muttered, "Call a priest too." Jack's hands shook beneath the table, tremors he couldn't hide. They found Elias Crow on his porch by the mill pond, staring at the trees like he expected them to blink. Elias said, "You heard it singing, didn't you?" Jack said, "I heard something wrong with teeth." Elias said, "Tracks come when the river runs low. Livestock die clean, folks lie." Ben asked, "What is it?" Elias said, "It steps where you step and learns your breath." Jack said, "We want truth." Elias said, "Warnings are truth you can carry." Wind combed the pond, ripples refusing to settle. Elias said, "When it looks at you, you remember what you buried." Jack looked away first. Dusk settled over the creek bed where mud kept secrets. Jack stepped beside Ben, careful not to ruin a track. Jack said, "Long stride, heavy 4-foot." Ben said, "It's heavier than it looks." Prince veered under a fence without bending wire. A calf lay beyond, opened like a book. Jack said, "No drag marks." The woods listened, tight-lipped. Ben whispered, "It's circling." A train horn wailed and faded. Jack said, "We mark, we map, we don't run." Darkness thickened, breath moved in the thicket. Ben said, "We should have run hours ago." The house kept the kind of quiet that made clocks sound like hammers, and Jack studied the old box of clippings he swore he would never open again. The narrator watched him unfold a photograph of a riverbank where someone he loved had vanished. Jack said, "Michael walked out here and left only tracks that pointed both ways." Ben said, "You never told me that part." Jack traced the margin where the newsprint had bled. He said, "I told myself the river took him, because rivers have names and rules." Ben said, "This thing has neither." The floor creaked like it remembered the night the patrol cars left. Jack said, "If it's the same, it has been waiting for my eyes." Ben said, "Then we stop waiting for its mercy." The box smelled like wet paper and old rain. The narrator felt the roomless toward the past as if gravity belonged to it. They found Ellie on the back steps counting breaths like beads, while the wind worried the wind chimes into a language adults forget. Ellie Mercer said, It sings outside my window and stands where the dog won't look. Jack said, dreams can feel sharp. Ellie said, it told me not to blink or it would leave a print on my tongue. Ben said, kids see edges we sand smooth, and the... Jack crouched and felt his knees argue with the boards. He said, tell me the tune. Ellie hummed 3 notes that made the chimes flinch. The narrator held the sound like a moth that did not want the jar. Jack said, you will sleep at my place tonight. Ellie said it already knows that. The yard quit pretending it was safe. Ben spread maps over the kitchen table like a battlefield and lined up markers where the prints bent logic. Ben said, it favors low ground and crosses fences where metal forgets to be hard. Jack said, it follows water and sound. Ben said, we set cameras on the creek bends and we track wind so our scent is wrong. Jack felt the old fear shape into something with a handle. He said, I am not losing anyone to a rumor again. Ben said, you won't lose me. The narrator watched their reflection in the dark window and thought how they looked like ghosts planning the living. Jack said, we go when the moon clears. Ben said, I was already lacing my boots. The house ticked, ready to hold its breath. Sheriff Dana met them by the lot where county trucks slept under sodium lamps, and paperwork weighed her hands more than any rifle. Dana Holt said, I have calls about trespassers and panicked livestock owners. Jack said, we have tracks that fit no boot. Dana said, we have tourists who love a story. Ben said, we have bodies laid open like textbooks. Dana's jaw worked as if the words tasted wrong. She said, I will not fuel hysteria for a legend that keeps the feed store busy. Jack said, it keeps the ground busy with things that don't rot right. The narrator watched a moth burn itself on orange light and fall in a spiral that felt like a warning. Dana said, do not play hunters in my county. Jack said, then protect it like something is hunting. They reached Miller's pasture before dawn when colors forgot their names, and the horizon looked stitched shut. The narrator took in the carcasses laid in a line that felt deliberate, as if someone were spelling with meat. Jack said, it is not feeding. Ben said, it is teaching. A windmill clacked like loose teeth. Jack said, no tracks between, only ends. Ben said, it doesn't travel the way we understand. Somewhere a bull bellowed and then regretted it. Jack said, mark the positions and count the hearts missing. Ben said, some seals look burned. The fog parted by inches, revealing the fence with hair knotted on barbs that did not match any a rancher could name. The moment tasted like batteries. Jack said, we're already inside its handwriting. The morning was thin and cold, and frost clung to the grass like the world was afraid to move forward. Jack followed the creek bend and stopped where the mud looked too carefully pressed. Jack said, it came back closer last night. Ben crouched and measured stride with his palm, then said, this one is deeper, heavier. Jack said, it's circling the house. The narrator felt the silence grow around them like the woods were listening with their teeth. Ben said, no drag, no stumble, every step is deliberate. Jack whispered, it wants to be seen. The creek bubbled once, then died quiet. Jack pressed his boot beside the print, and the size mocked him. He said, it's hunting us the way men hunt deer. The air thickened as if someone held their breath in the thicket, and the morning light felt colder than it should. They went to town where neighbors leaned too close, but never admitted what their eyes held. The diner buzzed with whispered words like insects. Jack asked one man, did you hear the cattle last night? The man looked away and said, coyotes run hungry this winter. Ben said, coyotes don't open fences and close them after. The narrator felt the crowd's silence bind like rope. An old woman clutched her coffee and said, you should keep your lights on, that's all. Jack said, keeping lights doesn't stop claws. Laughter followed from a corner, nervous, sharp as glass. A man muttered, you feed fear. It grows. Jack said, ignoring it grows faster. The town fell quiet again, and the clock's tick sounded like a warning. Back at the truck, Jack shoved his notes across the dash, lines crossing like veins. Ben said, "You're turning this into obsession." Jack said, "Obsession keeps us breathing." Ben said, "It'll break you before it breaks it." Jack's jaw locked and his hands rattled the paper. He said, "It already took my brother. I will not let it take her." Ben looked at him hard, then said, "Grief isn't a compass, Jack." The narrator felt the cab shrink until air was thin. Jack said, "You still think it's coyotes, say it now." Ben said, "I think you're chasing something you don't want to catch." Jack slammed the notebook shut, and the sound carried like a shot across empty fields. Ellie sat cross-legged on the rug, crayons scattered, drawing what adults could not name. Jack leaned down, voice thin. "Where did you see it?" Ellie said, "By the barn, taller than the door, eyes red like lanterns." Ben shifted uneasily and said, "She's just repeating stories." Ellie snapped. It waved like it knew my name. The narrator saw Jack's face pale, as if the floor tilted. Jack said, "What else did it do?" Ellie said, "It bent low, then smiled without lips." The drawing showed long black limbs wrapped around a house. Jack whispered, "She shouldn't know that." Ben muttered, "Or you taught her by accident." Ellie hummed the tune again, and the walls seemed to lean closer. Night fell with a weight that bent branches, and Jack stood on the porch, staring at the tree line. The narrator felt the dark lean in until sound cracked thin. A shape moved between pines, tall and patient. Jack whispered, "It's watching us now." Ben joined him, breath fogging, and said, "That's just shadow." Jack said, "Shadows don't breathe." A long sigh rolled from the trees, neither wind nor animal. The boards trembled under their boots. Ellie peeked from behind the curtain, her face pale. Jack said, "Inside, now." She whispered, "It already knows I'm here." The air pressed like a hand across the house, and the forest refused to give back its shape. The night cracked open with silence too deep, and the barn's door swayed as if pulled by unseen hands. Jack called out for Ben, but only echoes answered. The narrator felt the dark swallow voices like stones dropped in a well. Jack's lantern beam found only dust and a broken chain on the floor. He whispered, "Ben." The walls groaned, and straw shifted as though something large had dragged through moments earlier. Jack said, "He wouldn't leave without me." A hoofprint sunk deep into soil, followed by a human-like track pressed beside it. Jack muttered, "No man makes prints like this." His breath smoked in the cold air, heart pounding as the realization pressed in. Ben was gone, swallowed whole without a trace. Back inside his home, Jack tore at the floorboards until splinters marked his palms. Beneath lay a journal his father had hidden, pages brittle with secrets. The narrator watched Jack's face shift as ink scrawls told of tracks that stalked their bloodline for generations. Jack whispered, "He knew. He always knew." Words described livestock killed clean, children vanished, and the creatures circling every decade when the river dropped low. Jack said, "It's not chance, it's inheritance." Ellie stood pale in the doorway, asking, "Daddy, is it why Michael never came back?" Jack froze, unable to shape a lie. The journal trembled in his hands, truth heavier than bone. By morning, a figure appeared with confidence stitched into every step. Mark Hale, a neighbor too eager to help. He said, "I know trails the sheriff won't check." Jack eyed him with suspicion, asking why now. Mark smiled thin and said, "Because I've been waiting for it." The narrator saw Jack stiffen, mistrust burning through him. Mark continued, "You want answers, I can lead you." Ellie whispered, "I don't like his eyes." Jack said, "We'll see if his maps are worth the risk." Mark's charm cracked in places, showing something sharp beneath. Jack knew he needed allies, even false ones, but every instinct screamed betrayal, sat at the table with them. They returned to Elias Crow, who sat like a man carved from stone, watching the tree line with eyes gone hollow. Elias said, "It is no beast, it is a mind. It learns, it waits, and it chooses." Jack asked, "Why us?" Elias said, "Because it remembers you." The narrator felt words burn colder than air. Jack pressed. It stalked my father too, didn't it? Elias looked away. Voice cracked. Yes. And he bargained silence. Jack's hands shook as he said, no more silence. Elias said, then be ready, for once it knows your name, it will not stop. The pond rippled without wind, and shadows stretched across water like black veins. The forest exhaled a sound like laughter, and Jack felt his skin crawl as branches bent under weight, unseen. From between trunks, two eyes glowed and held their gaze longer than instinct allowed. Jack whispered, it's not random, it chose me. Ellie clutched his sleeve, trembling. The narrator felt the night shrink, pressing them closer to the inevitable. Jack shouted, why me? The air answered with movement, a shadow circling, deliberate and aware. The creature's shape loomed tall, edges too sharp, limbs too long, waiting. Jack's chest heaved as he realized this was no animal stalking survival. It was something that had written him into its story. The house shuddered under claws scraping against the siding, each drag long enough to split wood fibers. Jack gripped the rifle, though his hands shook. He whispered, it's here. Ellie clutched his arm, eyes wide. The narrator felt the air heavy, filled with breath that did not belong to them. Windows rattled as shadows shifted against the glass. Jack said, stay back from the light. The door trembled with a pounding, steady as a heartbeat. Ellie cried, it's trying to come in. Jack hissed, not tonight. The roof groaned above, and dust fell like ash. The house felt less like shelter and more like a box waiting to be opened. The window burst with a sound like bone snapping, and a clawed hand reached inside, inches from Ellie. Jack pulled her back, shouting, no. He fired, and glass rained down like falling stars. The narrator felt the recoil kick him hard as the shadow recoiled into the night. Ellie sobbed. It almost touched me. Jack said, not while I breathe. Outside, the howl rose, long and furious, circling the cabin. Floorboards vibrated with its weight above. Jack shouted, it wants you, Ellie. It wants the bloodline. She cried, then why me? Jack said, because it couldn't finish with Michael. Every word landed like a wound, the truth clawing louder than the beast. Outside, the pounding shifted to the back door, rattling hinges like loose teeth. Jack and Sheriff Dana pressed against it, holding it shut with their shoulders. Dana said, what in God's name is it? Jack grunted, something older than God here. The narrator felt the strain tear through their muscles as wood splintered. Dana shouted, it's not stopping. Jack said, then neither do we. Ellie screamed from the corner as the ceiling groaned above her. Dana's eyes flicked wide with fear as dust rained down. Jack whispered, this house won't hold. The pounding stopped suddenly, silence falling heavy as a hammer. Dana whispered, why did it stop? Jack said, because it wants us to listen. The roof collapsed inward with a crack like thunder, and the creature dropped into view, taller than men, limbs stretching too far. Eyes burned molten in the dark. Jack raised the rifle and fired, but the shot barely staggered it. The narrator felt the sound quake the walls, the recoil echoing uselessly. Ellie screamed, it's inside. Dana grabbed Jack's arm and yelled, we can't kill it. Jack shouted back, then we'll try. The beast bent low, shadows spilling like tar across the floor. Its gaze fixed on Jack, unblinking, as if it recognized him. The standoff stretched thin, terror holding its breath before the next strike. Amid the chaos, Ben's voice called from the tree line, faint but desperate. Jack, over here. Jack froze, disbelief cutting deeper than fear. He shouted, Ben? The creature tilted its head, almost smiling, and stepped back into the shadows. Dana gasped, it's letting us go. Jack's chest heaved, torn between relief and dread. The narrator felt the air lift, but only because something darker was waiting. Jack ran outside, calling, Ben! But the clearing held only mist and broken branches. Ellie cried, don't leave us! Jack whispered. It took him, and now it wants me to follow. The howl rose again, closer than ever, dragging the night tight around them. Dawn arrived thin and colorless, and the house stood like a ribcage that had forgotten its heart. The narrator watched Jack sweep glass into a bucket that rang like a bell no one wanted. Ellie stood in the doorway, holding a blanket she did not feel. Jack said, "We're still here." Sheriff Dana paced through the wreckage and said, "You are lucky to be." The roof sagged in a slow ache. Jack whispered, "It chose to leave." Dana said, "Or it never needed to stay." The quiet crawled over them like frost. Ellie asked, "Is Ben coming back?" Jack said nothing, and silence made the answer. The wind paused against the walls as if listening for names. Dana said, "You need a hospital." Jack said, "We need to bury what it touched." The day felt like a thin bandage over a wound that would not close. By mid-morning, the county lot filled with voices that sounded official and eyes that looked shut. The narrator counted clipboards, cameras, and words like animal control, storm, and insurance. Dana said, "They will not hear what does not fit forms." Jack held out photos of tracks, and a man in a suit said, "Boots distort mud." Jack said, "Boots don't cauterize." The man smiled like a door closing. Ellie shrank behind Jack, and someone offered a pamphlet about trauma. Jack said, "Truth is not therapy." Dana pinched the bridge of her nose and said, "Let me try." The wind carried the smell of bleach from a cleanup truck, and it felt like an eraser. The suit said no further action. The narrator felt the verdict hit like quiet thunder. They met Mark at the edge of the pasture where fog lay low like guilt. Mark said, "I can get this to people who understand." The narrator heard confidence where honesty should live. Jack asked, "Why should I trust you after last night's vanishing act?" Mark said, "I scouted lines it used." Jack said, "It used you." Mark's smile twitched and settled. Ellie stared at the fence where hair still knotted like letters. She said, "It knows his name." Mark took a step back, hands raised. He said, "I want out of this." Jack said, "Then stop selling maps to my ruin." The sky threatened rain, and the prints darkened like ink. Mark said, "You'll need me when it returns." Jack said, "I need truth more than a guide." Back home, gear lay on the table like tools of a story no one would publish. The narrator watched Jack load drives, photos, and the journal into a metal box. Ellie said, "We could show the world." Jack said, "The world would show its teeth." He carried the box to the burn barrel behind the shed, and the wind turned still. Dana arrived, breath fogging, and said, "Evidence matters." Jack said, "Evidence made them kinder liars." He struck a match, and the flame worried the edges, then trusted them to ash. Ellie asked, "Will this keep us safe?" Jack said, "It keeps us unseen." The fire cracked like old bones. The smoke smelled like ink dying, and the sky pretended not to watch. At the mill pond, Elias sat with the patience of stone while evening fell into the water like coins. Jack said, "I burned it." Elias nodded, as if fires were old friends. He said, "Silence can be a shelter or a bell." The narrator watched ripples thread outward and return with nothing. Ellie stood between them, small and fierce. She said, "Will it stop now?" Elias said, "It never stops. It only chooses quieter roads." Jack said, "Then tell me how to live with it." Elias said, "Name what you love, keep watch, and never run alone." A crane lifted slow, dark against the last light. Jack looked at his reflection and said, "It will not take her." The pond kept their voices and gave back the hush. The farmhouse sat hollow beneath a swollen moon, and Jack lingered in the silence like a man left behind. The narrator felt each creak of the boards carry memory instead of weight. Jack said, "It's not over, only quieter." Ellie slept upstairs, though her breathing sometimes paused as if listening. Jack stared at the wall, fingers tracing cracks like maps. He whispered, Every silence is its shadow. The wind rattled the window once, a reminder more than a threat. Jack's face hardened as if resolve had to wear grief like armor. He muttered, "I'll keep watch." The night gave no answer but felt awake. Ellie's humming drifted down the stairs like a thread, sweet and fragile, yet wrong. Jack stiffened, recognizing the melody from the night creature's breath. He whispered, "No, not you." The narrator felt the air tighten, as if the song drew walls closer. Jack climbed slowly, each step screaming louder in his chest. Ellie sat cross-legged on her bed, drawing the creature with steady hands. She looked up and said, "It knows me now." Jack said, "Don't let it inside you." She whispered, "It already is." The tune spilled from her lips again, chilling as a blade against glass. Mark returned, face pale, knocking with the desperation of a man chased by his own lies. He said, "You were right. It wants blood, not truth." Jack held the door but did not open it. He asked, "What did you give it?" Mark stammered, "I thought if I offered names it would spare me." The narrator heard betrayal peel the night like bark. Jack said, "You let it closer." Mark begged, "Help me, it won't stop." Ellie whispered from the stairs, "It never stops." Jack closed the door and said, "Then you already chose." Outside, the pounding ceased, and silence was heavier than screams. From the woods came a howl, stretched longer than distance, curling through the valley like smoke. Jack gripped the rifle, though he knew it meant nothing. The narrator felt the house hold its breath. Ellie said, "It's closer." Dana arrived on the porch, eyes wide, whispering, "That sound wasn't wind." Jack said, "It's a promise." The howl faded, replaced by silence sharp enough to cut. The tree line swayed, though no wind stirred. Jack whispered, "It will not stop until I stand before it." Ellie clutched the stair rail and said, "It already stands before you." The house groaned like it understood. Later, Jack opened his father's journal to add words of his own, but the page trembled in his grip. The narrator saw his hand scrawl, "If you're reading this, it found me." He stared at the line, knowing it was not warning but inevitability. Upstairs, Ellie hummed the tune, soft as a prayer. Jack closed the book, and the sound of claws skittered across the roof. He whispered, "So be it." The fire in the hearth dimmed as if afraid. Beyond the windows, the woods leaned closer. The last line in ink stayed wet, waiting for the next hand.